Namaste and welcome to Daily News Simplified, the what, why and how of newspaper reading. Now we would be analyzing the Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper of 5th of April 2019, and the news that would be covered today is given on the screen, and the timestamp for the same is given in the description and the comment section given below. And so now with this, let us start with the first article. Now we have taken the lead editorial from the editorial page on page 8. Now what this editorial talks about is how can democracy be meaningful within India, and how can you and me as citizens of India contribute further to our Indian democracy. Now you should see this editorial first from the perspective of GS paper 1 within the subsection political philosophies and their forms and effects on society, wherein the particular political philosophy that this editorial talks about is about democracy. However, the main aspect that you should see this editorial is from the perspective of essay, which is your paper 1 in your mains examination. Now, several direct questions have been asked in your essay examination with regards to democracy. However, apart from this, several indirect questions with regards to democracy have been continuously asked within your essay examination. And it is within that context that we're going to understand as to what this author means when he says that democracy should be made meaningful within India. Now, what do we mean by democracy? Now, the author considers three main attributes of a democracy. First is to have elections on regular intervals. The second attribute is to have a multi-party competition. And the third attribute is to have universal adult franchise, which means that Indian citizens have the right to vote without any form of discrimination based on gender, caste, ethnicity, language or religion. Now the author raises a problem with this popular understanding of democracy within India, whereby what is happening is that we're equating or assuming that democracy equals elections. Whereby if India continues to have elections, we're a democracy. Now the problem with this assumption is that democracy and elections are related to each other but are two different ideas. Now according to the author, elections lead to having a democracy within a country or becomes the mean for a country to become democratic. However, according to the author, a country requires various other aspects to become an effective democracy. Now a simple example of this would be the country of Russia. Now, as you already understand, that Vladimir Putin is currently the president of Russia who has been elected by the people of Russia. But can Russia be considered as a democracy? And the main reason as to why Russia is not considered as an effective democracy because it misses several aspects that make a country democratic. And it is within that context that the author is saying that just by having elections, it does not mean that a country is democratic. Whereby conducting elections can lead towards democracy, or it could be one of the means towards democracy, but elections in itself does not mean democracy. So now what are these several aspects that make a country an effective democracy? Now the first aspect which has been given by the author is that a country should have a political community of free and equal citizens. Now an example of this would have been South Africa during the apartheid regime. Now what happened during the apartheid regime of South Africa was that the black citizens were denied voting rights and they were not treated as free and equal citizens as part of the political community of South Africa. And therefore, even though South Africa may have conducted elections during its apartheid regime, it did not mean that it was an effective democracy because majority of the black citizens were denied their voting rights and the right of being free and equal citizens to the white community within the political system of South Africa. The second aspect which has been highlighted by the author is that there should be strong constitutional and public institutions within a country. Now, a main example of this would be the country of Pakistan, whereby what is seen in Pakistan is that the military, in particular the army of Pakistan, and its intelligence agency ISI are the most strongest public institutions within Pakistan. And these two public institutions of Pakistan control over the executive of that country, the legislature of that country, and even the judiciary of Pakistan. And therefore Pakistan would not be considered as an effective democracy if its public institutions or the institutions which have been formed by its constitution, such as the judiciary, the legislative, the executive, continue to be dominated and serve the army and the intelligence of Pakistan. The third aspect highlighted by the author is that an effective democracy audits its political parties and holds them accountable to the promises that they have made. Now an example of this would be our country, India itself. Now as citizens of this country, And the other pillars of Indian democracy, which being the free media, do they hold the political parties within India accountable to the various promises that they make during elections? And what is generally being seen in India is that if some political party has not fulfilled its promises, then as citizens of this country, we only have one option, that is to elect another political party. Therefore, the only accountability measures against political parties that we have as citizens of India is to elect another political party. And this does not seem as a measure of accountability, but rather as a consequence of one political party not fulfilling its promises and then us electing another political party. And this replacement of political parties during elections, it does not mean that we have held the earlier political party accountable to its various promises. And therefore, according to the author, one of the measures that India especially needs is that we need to have more accountability measures with regards to the promises that political parties make. Now, the fourth aspect highlighted by the author is that measures such as access to quality education, ability to get educated, work within their mother tongue, neighborhood schools, strengthening of public health systems, public transport, universal social insurance, and various other types of socio-economic measures. Now, these are the four main aspects which has been highlighted by the author through which a country can become an effective democracy. Now, the question that comes up after understanding all of these four aspects is what is holding us back as citizens of India to pursue these several aspects to making India an effective democracy. Now, the main reason, as according to the author, as to why we as citizens of India are not able to pursue these objectives of making India an effective democracy is that we continue to believe that elections are the solution in making India an effective democracy. Now, the common assumption within India is that if one political party is not performing well, then we should replace it with another political party. And this idea of replacing political parties leads to the assumption that elections are a solution to effective democracy within India. Now, according to the author, this false assumption has been fed to the Indian citizens by the popular media and by the political parties themselves. Now, the main reason as to why the media and the political parties are feeding an assumption that elections are a solution to an effective democracy within India so that they are not held accountable. Now, political parties are avoiding accountability in each election year. Now, India has had general elections within 2009, 2014, and now again in 2019. And what is happening in each general election year is that the party which has been in power is not being held accountable to the promises that they have made. And similarly, the party which is in opposition also continues to make promises that they will fulfill once they're elected. And what is happening in each election year is that each political party is saying that replace the party in power and elect us based on our promises. However, once a political party is elected, the people of India are not able to hold them accountable for the promises that they have made. And similarly, according to the author, this is also being seen with regards to the popular media within India, whereby the media, as being the fourth pillar of democracy, is not fulfilling its responsibility. Whereby what is happening is that the media is not holding accountable the political or the opposition party. Now, this is the main reason, according to the author, as to why the Indian citizens are not able to pursue various objectives so as to make India an effective democracy and making India's democracy meaningful. And so hopefully within that regard, you have understood as to what are the problems and what is the solution according to the author so as to make democracy within India meaningful. And so now with this, let us move on to the next article. Now we have taken this editorial from the editorial page on page 8. Now the main crux of this editorial is quite small. Now there is no global regulatory regime so as to address the issue of the growing militarization in space. And within that regard, India has continuously expressed concerns about the weaponization of outer space. Now within that regard, India has been pursuing the global community so as to draft an international law on the prevention of an arms race in space. However, what this editorial is also highlighting is that the government of India should also articulate or provide the various doctrinal aspects of its own space program. Whereby when we say the doctrinal aspects, it means the various principles that guide the space program of India. Now the main reason as to why this editorial has said that the government of India should provide the principles of the government policy with regards to India's space program so that this policy can show the peaceful intentions that India has with regards to outer space. And by highlighting the various peaceful intentions of India's space program, it would reduce the chances of the major powers, and especially of India's neighbor, to not be fearful or have doubts with regards to India's space program. So now hopefully you understood the main crux of this editorial. However, what is required for you to understand with regards to your UPSC examination is what is the current global regulatory regime with regards to outer space within the world. Now there are basically 5 treaties of the United Nations which relates to activities within the outer space. Now the main treaty of the United Nations which deals with outer space is the Outer Space Treaty, which came into force in 1967. However, there are 4 other treaties within the United Nations which follow around the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. Now, the first of these treaties is the Rescue Agreement of 1968, which requires every country to assist an astronaut in case of an accident. The second treaty is the Liability Convention of 1972, which provides the various parameters under which a country can claim liability for any damage that has been caused to its space objects. Now, an example of this is, let's say the anti-satellite missile that was launched by India would have accidentally damaged some other satellite, then that country whose satellite would have been damaged by the anti-satellite missile of India can claim liability from the Indian government under the Liability Convention of 1972. The third main treaty of the United Nations with regards to outer space is the Registration Convention of 1975. Now this convention requires every country to register all forms of object which it has launched into outer space. So now basically this is a registry with the United Nations which lists all the objects which have been launched into outer space. Now the fifth and the last UN treaty with regards to outer space is the Moon Agreement of 1979. Now this Moon Agreement of 1979 basically elaborates the various provisions of the Outer Space Treaty and further defines them on how they should be applied to the moon and other celestial bodies. Now with regards to these 5 treaties, India has signed all 5 of these. However, with regards to these 5 treaties, India has only ratified 4 of these treaties. Now India has yet not ratified the Moon Agreement of 1979. Now, out of these 5 UN treaties, the main treaty whose features that you need to remember, especially with regards to your upcoming prelims examination, is the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. Now, this Outer Space Treaty of 1967 is basically an international treaty which is binding in all of its members so that they may use the outer space only for peaceful purposes. Now, the first main objective of this treaty is that countries are prohibited from placing nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction either in orbit or the moon or any other celestial bodies within the space. Now, a common concern that has been raised with regards to this feature is that when we say weapons of mass destruction, it is currently vague within the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. However, it has generally been assumed that when we say weapons of mass destruction, especially with regards to the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, it would include nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, and biological weapons. Now, the second feature of this treaty is that countries cannot claim sovereignty over the moon or other celestial bodies. Now, what this means is that the United States, China, or any other country cannot go to the moon or claim any territory as being part of China or the United States, whereby the moon and other celestial bodies are considered as common heritage of mankind. Now, the third main feature of the Outer Space Treaty is that countries would be responsible for activities within space. Now, what this means is that countries would be responsible for the activities that the government has undertaken within space and also for the activities of private companies or private entities within space. Therefore, any damage which might be caused in outer space from a country, they would be liable to pay damages. Now, an example of this is, let's say SpaceX, which is a private company within the United States, causes some damage to satellites or spacecrafts of any other country within space, then the United States would be liable to pay damages to the country whose satellite or spacecraft has been damaged by SpaceX. Now, this liability provision of the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 has been further highlighted in the Liability Convention of 1972. The fourth main principle of the Outer Space Treaty is that a country's space installations and vehicles shall be open on a reciprocal basis to representatives of other countries. Now, outer space is considered as a common heritage of mankind. Therefore, it is necessary for every country to cooperate in outer space. Now, an example of this would be the Soviet Union and the United States, whereby the space agencies of both the countries used to cooperate with each other heavily during the Cold War, whereby even the astronauts of the United States would use the Soyuz capsule, which was the spacecraft of the Soviet Union, to fly to the International Space Station. Now, the fifth and the last main point of the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 is that countries cannot establish military bases or installations or test any types of weapons or conduct military exercise on the moon and other celestial bodies. Now, a common concern which has been raised with regards to this point is that outer space still can be used as means of transit for weapons, whereby what is seen is that anti-satellite missiles and ballistic missiles which go up to the outer space and then come back are not currently prohibited under the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. Similarly, the Outer Space Treaty does not prohibit the use of military satellites within space. Now, these were the main points that you needed to understand with regards to the global regulatory framework with regards to outer space. And so now with this, let us move on to the next article. Now, we have taken this article from page 1. Now, what this article talks about is that the Monetary Policy Committee of the Reserve Bank of India has cut the benchmark lending rate. Now, there's some important aspects that you need to understand from this article, but before understanding any of them, you need to first understand as to what is the repo rate. Now, we have covered repo rate in previous DNS video, and therefore what we'll do today is again revise as to what is the repo rate from the perspective of your prelims examination. Now, repo is a short form for repurchase option, and it is a money market instrument which is used to target inflation. Now, the legal definition of repo rate as per the Reserve Bank of India Act of 1934 means that repo or the repurchase option is an instrument for borrowing funds, and this fund is borrowed by selling securities, wherein an agreement is signed to repurchase the securities at a mutually agreed future date, and this repurchase at a future date would be at an agreed price and an agreed upon interest rate. So let's say the State Bank of India has some government securities and it wants to sell these government securities to the Reserve Bank of India. Now let's say Reserve Bank of India buys these government securities from the State Bank of India for a period of 1 year at a price of 10 crores and at an interest rate of 7%. Now after this, the State Bank of India would have to buy back these government securities from the Reserve Bank of India after the period of 1 year. And the State Bank of India would have to buy back these government securities from the Reserve Bank of India at an interest rate of 7%. And this interest rate of 7% is known as the repurchase option or the repo rate, wherein the State Bank of India is repurchasing these government securities, and the rate at which this repurchase is being done is known as the repo rate. Now you have to understand that this is a simplified example, but hopefully you've understood the functioning of the repo rate. Now this repo rate or the benchmark policy rate is decided by the 6-member Monetary Policy Committee of the Reserve Bank of India. Now what has happened in this news is that the 6-member Monetary Policy Committee, which is headed by the Governor of the RBI Urjit Patel, has decided not to change the repo rate. And the reason they have decided not to change the repo rate so as to keep the retail inflation at 4%. Now another aspect that you should understand is that if the repo rate is increased, then it is considered that it may lead to less borrowing for commercial banks. There also may be a higher rate for consumer loans that are given out by commercial banks. And lastly, if the repo rate is increased, there may be a chance that it may absorb the excess liquidity in the market. However, if the repo rate is decreased, then it leads to easier borrowing for commercial banks. Apart from this, there is also a chance that it may lead to lowering of rate for consumer loans. And lastly, if the repo rate is decreased, there is also a chance of an increased liquidity in the market. Now you have to understand that these impact of an increase in repo rate or a decrease in repo rate should be seen within the context of being speculative also. However, hopefully you've understood the various aspects with regards to the repo rate, wherein the repurchase option, which is known as the repo rate, is a money market instrument which is used to target inflation, and the legal definition of repo means an instrument for borrowing funds by selling securities. However, these securities which have been sold need to be repurchased on a future date on an agreed price and an interest rate. So if the State Bank of India has borrowed funds from the Reserve Bank of India by selling government securities, and therefore the State Bank of India would have to repurchase these securities on a later date. And for repurchasing these securities, the State Bank of India would have to pay interest to the Reserve Bank of India. And on the rate on which the State Bank of India repurchases the securities from the Reserve Bank of India is known as the repo rate. And this repo rate is decided by a 6-member monetary policy committee which is headed by the Governor of the Reserve Bank of India. So now hopefully you've understood as to what is repo rate. Now let us understand why the Reserve Bank of India has cut the repo rate. Now the first main reason is that the rate of inflation has remained below the targeted 4%. Now as you can see from this graph, wherever there is a high inflation within India, the Reserve Bank of India keeps a high repo rate. And similarly, whenever there is a decrease within the inflation rate within India, there is a decrease in the repo rate. The second main reason as to why there has been a cut in the repo rate is because there has been a decrease in the GDP forecast. Now to give a boost to the GDP growth rate, the Reserve Bank of India has cut the repo rate. Now the third reason as to why there has been a cut in the repo rate is because the output gap has remained negative. Now it is important for you to understand as to what is an output gap, especially with regards to your upcoming prelims examination. Now output gap refers to the difference between the actual output of the economy and its maximum potential. Now since there is a negative output gap, it means that the economy is performing less than the maximum potential of the Indian economy. Now you need to further understand as to what is meant by negative output gap and the positive output gap. Now since there is a negative output gap within the Indian economy, it means that the Indian economy is not fulfilling up to its potential. And further it means that the available resources within the Indian economy are not being completely utilized and therefore reflects a deficient demand. Now let us understand this in a simple example. Now let's say the maximum potential of the Indian economy is to produce 100 units. However, what is currently being seen is that the Indian economy is only producing 80 units. Therefore, there is another potential of 20 units within the Indian economy which is currently not being utilized. And therefore, what this 20 units reflect is a deficient demand within the Indian economy. Now, the Reserve Bank of India has decided that to increase demand within the Indian economy, they have cut the repo rate. Now, there is another perspective to this that you also need to understand. Now, let's say there is a positive output gap within the Indian economy. Now what this means is that let's say the Indian economy has the potential to produce 100 units, but what the Indian economy is doing is that it is producing 140 units. Therefore what this means is that the Indian economy is producing extra 40 units. Therefore what these 40 units reflect is an excess demand within the Indian economy. Now what does happen when there is an excess demand within an economy? It leads to inflation. Now, if I were to ask you a question as to what would be the decision of the Reserve Bank of India with regards to repo rate if there had been a positive output gap within the Indian economy. Now, as we have already understood from this graph, that whenever there is an increase in inflation, the Reserve Bank of India increases the repo rate. So therefore, if there is a positive output gap, it means that there is excess demand within the Indian economy, which would further lead to inflation. Therefore, the decision of the Reserve Bank of India with regards to repo rate would be to increase it. Now, this concept with regards to output gap, you need to remember with regards to your upcoming prelims examination. That whenever there is a negative output gap, it means that there is deficient demand within the economy and it would likely lead the Reserve Bank of India to decrease the repo rate. However, if there is a positive output gap within the Indian economy, it reflects that there is excess demand within the Indian economy, which would further lead to inflation, and thereby there is a higher chance that the Reserve Bank of India would increase the repo rate if there is a positive output gap. Now, the fourth main reason to increase the repo rate by the Reserve Bank of India is that there has been a decrease in credit flow to the industrial sector, especially the MSME. Therefore, this cut in the repo rate by the Reserve Bank of India is intended to ensure that banks are able to lend more money to the industrial sector. Now, these are the main reasons as to why there has been a decision by the Monetary Policy Committee of the Reserve Bank of India to cut the repo rate. So now hopefully you've understood two main concepts, especially with regards to your prelims examination from this article. First, what is output gap? And secondly, what is repo rate? And so now with this, let us move on to the next article. Now there are two articles, whereby the first article with regards to vultures has appeared in the page number 7 while the second article with regards to the Komodo dragon has appeared on page 18. Now the news with regards to both of these animals are not relevant with regards to your UPSC examination. And therefore what we're going to do today is understand about the long-billed vulture or the Indian vulture and also about the Komodo dragon in a question answer format within the context of your prelims examination. Now there are two questions for your practice, and what you need to do is pause this video, solve both of these questions and wait for 5 seconds for the correct answer. Now the correct answer to question number 1 is A, 2 only. Now the Indian vulture has been listed as critically endangered under the IUCN list. Now question with regards to statement number 2 has already been asked in a much previous prelims examination, whereby the diclofenac drug is the primary cause of mass mortality among Indian vultures. Now what generally happens is that this diclofenac drug is fed to various cattle within India. Now when these cattle die and the vultures feed on the bodies of these dead cattle, they consume this diclofenac drug, and this diclofenac drug then leads to the death of that vulture. And the usage of the diclofenac drug has become the main reason for the mass mortality of all forms of Indian vultures. Now with regards to statement number 3, there is an alternative drug with regards to diclofenac. Now this alternative drug is known as meloxicam and has proved itself to be an acceptable substitute for diclofenac. Now there's one more fact with regards to Indian vulture that you need to know, is that it is also protected under Schedule 1 of the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972. Now with regards to question number 2, the correct answer is C, both 1 and 2, whereby the Komodo dragon is a species of lizard which is only found in Indonesia. And similarly, it is also listed as vulnerable under the IUCN Red List. Now these were the main information that you needed to understand about the Indian vulture and the Komodo dragon from the perspective of prelims examination. And so now with this, let us move on to the next article. Now we have taken this opinion-based editorial from page 9. Now what is required to be understood from this editorial is about the Mishing Community and their festival known as Borag. And you need to understand about this from the perspective of your prelims examination. Now what generally happens is that each year within your prelims examination, at least one question is asked with regards to various festivals or the ethnic groups or the tribes of the Northeast region. And it is within that context that we're going to understand about the Mishing Community and their festival Borag. Now the first point that you need to know is that the Mishing Community belongs to the North Assam branch of the great Tibet-Mongolite linguistic family. Now as you already understand that there are various linguistic families such as the Indo-European language, the Dravidian group, apart from being the Tibet-Mongolian linguistic family, whereby Hindi is part of the Indo-European language group, the Tamil is part of the Dravidian language group, and similarly the Mishing Community of North Assam belong to the great Tibet-Mongolian linguistic family. Now an important aspect about the Mishing Community is that they inhabit the riverine tracts along the Brahmaputra and the Subansiri river within Assam. Now an important fact about the Mishing Community is that they're described as the only riparian tribe of Northeast India. Now the third main fact about the Mishing Community is that they practice the cult of Donye-Polo. Now the Donye-Polo cult mainly means the worshipping of the sun and the moon. Another important fact about the Mishing Community is that they inhabit the world's largest river island, which is called Majuli and is located in the state of Assam. Now this island Majuli is located on the river Brahmaputra, and the Mishing tribe migrated to the Majuli Islands from Arunachal Pradesh. Now the fourth main fact that you need to remember about the Mishing Community is that their main festival is known as Ali Ai Lilang. Now this is a spring festival and is associated with the beginning of the sowing season of the paddy crop. Apart from this, another festival of the Mishing Community is Borag, which is a harvest festival of the paddy rice. Therefore, an important difference that you need to remember is that the Ali Ai Liang festival of the Mishing Community celebrates the beginning of the sowing season, while the Borag festival of the Mishing Community celebrates the harvest of the paddy rice. Now the last main fact about the Mishing Community is that they are the second largest tribe within the state of Assam. Now the largest tribe in the state of Assam is the Bodo tribe, and the Mishing Community is the second largest tribe within the state of Assam. Now the Mishing tribe within the state of Assam is a scheduled tribe, as they have been listed under the Scheduled Tribes Order of 1950. However, the Mishing tribe under the Scheduled Tribes Order of 1950 have been listed under the name Miri. Now this was a derogatory name which was given to the Mishing tribe by the British government. and there have been strong demands by the Mishing community to change their name from Miri to Mishing in the Scheduled Tribes Order of 1950. Now these are the main facts that you needed to know about the Mishing community. And so now with this, let us move on to the next section. Now there are two more questions for your practice. Now with regards to question number 3, the first statement has been taken from the Prelims examination of 2007, while the second statement has been taken from the Prelims examination of 2017. Now what you need to do is pause this video, solve both of these questions and wait for 5 seconds for the correct answer. Now the correct answer to question number 3 is C, both 1 and 2. Now repo rate is the rate at which other banks borrow from the Reserve Bank of India, and similarly the RBI's benchmark interest rate is decided by the Monetary Policy Committee, whereby the Monetary Policy Committee is headed by the Chairman of the Reserve Bank of India. Now with regards to question number 4, the correct answer is D, 1 and 3. Now output gap does refer to the difference between the actual output of the economy and its maximum potential. Now with regards to statement number 2, a positive output gap does not reflect a deficient demand in the economy, whereby it is the negative output gap which reflects a deficient demand within the economy, whereby the positive output gap reflects excess demand within the Indian economy. Now with regards to statement number 3, as you have already understood, the positive output gap does indicate excess demand within the economy, and one of the consequences of excess demand on an economy is inflation. Therefore, a positive output gap does indicate inflationary pressure on an economy. Now there are two more questions for your practice, and as you already understand, pause this video, solve both of these questions and wait for 5 seconds for the correct answer. Now the correct answer to question number 5 is D, neither 1 nor 2. Now India has signed and ratified the Outer Space Treaty. Now with regards to the various treaties on outer space, India has yet not ratified the Moon Treaty. Now with regards to statement number 2, the Outer Space Treaty does not prohibit the use of outer space for any military purposes. Now what you see is that satellites for military purposes, the use of anti-satellite missiles, and similarly other military initiatives are undertaken in outer space without the violation of the Outer Space Treaty. Now with regards to question number 6, the correct answer is D, neither 1 nor 2. Now the Mishing community settlements are not only found in the Majuli Island, whereby they are also found in the plain and the hill areas of Arunachal Pradesh and of Assam. While statement number 2 is also wrong. Now Porag is a celebration of post-harvest festival. And now with this we come to an end in the analysis of today's newspaper. Now we move on to the question for today.